Today we're going to be talking about the subject that nobody wants to talk about and that there's never a good time to talk about. And that's the idea of how to suffer well.
Welcome to the 3D Disciples podcast, where we're working together to develop disciples who display God's love as we deploy into God's world. Join us on this journey by liking, subscribing, and following this channel. I'm your host, Hannah, and alongside us is the pastor of FBC Clarion, Jason Hunter. May Jesus help us climb to new heights. Okay, so I feel a little ill-equipped to lead the questions for this episode. And I would really love to hear from the listeners to ask some questions about suffering, because that's a broad topic and everyone has different experiences with it.
But everybody has an experience with it.
Everyone has a experience with it, certainly so. So what I would recommend to the listeners, if you could go to our website at fbcclarion.com. And there's a button on there called Talk to the Podcast where you can record audio or just send in via some sort of text, type in on your keyboard, any questions you have, and maybe we'll do like a follow-up episode because you did 3 sermons on this. We had Matt's experience, and I'm sure everyone has something that they would like to ask you
Well,
if they haven't already. So anyways, listeners, please submit your questions on suffering. And where I was also going to go with this was when I was in high school, I was a member of the Fellowship of Christian Students, and we would meet Sunday morning or school mornings, and like we were allowed to prepare the sermons. One time I decided that, I'm going to try to do a sermon on suffering as a high schooler. That lasted for about a day, and then I was like, no, I'm abandoning this topic. I have no idea how to preach on this. So kudos to you for preaching on it. So I was going to ask, in the confession episode, I had asked you who, what, why, how, where, when, all those things. I think for this discussion, maybe we teeter-totter away from just like the why, because the point of this manual is to talk about, or at least in this section, this D that we're in, develop. We're talking about how suffering makes you develop, right?
Right.
Like we're not going to get into the theology of
like
why
the problem
suffering.
of evil. It's called, the theological term is the problem of evil and why evil and suffering even exist and so forth. So yeah, I'm not trying to, and there's a fancy word for that. Mm-hmm. Your answer to that, or how you answer the problem of evil, is called a theodicy. Mm-hmm. And so there's all kinds of theodicies out there. There's all kinds of theological stances on the problem of evil. But yeah, and even in some papers and some study I've written, I always kind of sidestep that because I have some answers to I have my own theodicy, I have my own views of that, mm-hmm. but it's all over the map. And what I've discovered in being with people who are suffering, and a lot of people want to figure out the source of it, why it exists or why it's there, mm-hmm. but it never offers any comfort, mm-hmm. Because it doesn't change wherever it came from.
I'm still in it. Yeah.
It doesn't change it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just want to let listeners know that we're going to stay away from that part of it and just talk about how it helps us develop as disciples. So I also went down a rabbit hole of various scenarios that I think would cause me to suffer that I haven't really experienced yet. Some of those being like traumatically losing a loved one, being in constant and persistent pain, like due to some form of illness, being held captive or tortured, experience constant bombing or like enemy attacks, or not being able to worship freely. So that made me kind of scared, like thinking about all of these things. But you said in one of your sermons that we should anticipate that we will suffer or that it will arrive. So is it okay to be afraid of its arrival, or would you suggest a different mindset?
Well, I don't know that. Well, I don't think I would say it's okay to fear it, because even when we talked about freedom, one of the freedoms that we're supposed to be free is freedom from fear.
Yep,
as far as God, having a relationship with God, like when we fear God, all other fear should diminish. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons people do fear suffering is they don't anticipate it. And so they're usually caught off guard. They usually have no plan. They usually have no direction when suffering arrives. And so my encouragement was, if you anticipate it, you think about, one day I'm going to suffer. There are various ways that could be. I don't know what that's going to be, and it may even be something I can't even think of or haven't thought of or won't think of. But I want to consider that it's going to happen for sure. And how do I hope to react? How do I want to handle that when that comes? And so not only anticipate its arrival, but anticipate, how do I want to react? What message do I want to give whenever I face certain kind of sufferings? How do I want to deal with it? How do I hope I deal with it? And again, even in my own life, I want to, I hope I do, I'm not sure I will, kind of idea, but at least thinking about it gives you, my hope is that it's not quite as scary. It's not as frightful because I got a plan. Like I know this is coming, and that's for sure. And what most people, I think, do, they avoid thinking about it. They avoid anticipating it. They avoid the contemplation of it, or
the possibility,
of it, or whatever. And then when it happens, they're caught off guard, and then they don't handle it well, or they feel overwhelmed by it. They don't feel like they have a direction. But you think about how many other things you plan in your life. You think about, you think about getting married. You're like, oh, what do I want my wedding to be like? Now, does every detail come out like you had originally planned it? Probably not.
No, not someone that gets married during the pandemic.
Right. Exactly. Who knew there was going to be a pandemic? That wasn't part of my plan. But you had direction. You think about jobs. You think about, oh, we're going to build a house or buy a house, and how is mortgages going to work, and where do we want? You anticipate all these things of life, and when they come up, you've considered it, and so you have like a roadmap, kind of how you want to. You're hoping things will go.
I like that. A roadmap, though, is a really good way of describing it, because like without the manual. Or these conversations, like you were just saying right before we started recording it, people come up to you and said, like, I really appreciate these sermons are like helping guide me through this suffering that I maybe had or am having right now. Right. Yeah. So then you would also mention that like Jesus was the suffering servant, and in every way possible, he suffered such the same ways that you and I will suffer. And I'm just going to quote what you had said there, because you kind of just punched each line, and it really hit me as to like, wow, he really has suffered in every way that we have. So you said he's been betrayed by the people closest to him, experienced death and loss, had a demanding schedule, was misunderstood, was mistreated, lied to, lied about, and ended up dying on a cross for something he didn't do. And I don't know, sometimes I just feel like there were some things like, okay, well, Jesus was never married. Oh, well, Jesus never had kids. Like maybe he won't understand the same sufferings that we have. But when I think about like being like what Judas did to him, like that's someone super close to him. And not only did he betray him, like as in like, oh, he cheated on me, or oh, he did that. Like he literally sent him to his death. And so, or
Peter.
Oh yeah.
And here's a really cool. There's a little nuance in the story about Peter denying Christ that kind of blows me away. So he does it twice. The third time, Peter, and I think it's out of the book of Luke, when Peter denies him the third time, he looks at Christ and Christ looks at him. So he's doing it possibly within ear sound of Christ. And so it's not like Christ is in some off corner and Peter's doing it outside protected, but they make eye contact. And that's what breaks Peter's heart. And he goes away crying after that. But it's like he denies him the third time, and the Bible kind of describes them making eye contact. Like Christ looked at him, and he looked at Christ, and then he turns and runs away. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's not only just denying, it's denying him. It would be like you and your husband in the same room, and some old girlfriend comes up and he goes, I don't know who that is, in front of you.
That's not my wife.
That would.
And then like him experiencing death and loss, like okay, we think about how much we might love our children, like, and he would have loved every single person he encountered that same way. So he would have definitely experienced
Well,
death
think
and
about
loss.
when he comes down into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
It says he looks on the city and he starts to weep because he's like, if you'd have known the time of your visitation, you would have welcomed me. But he knew that the city was going to fall because they had rejected him, and that like he told the disciples, like no stone would be left unturned. Like this, like they were going to die, they were going to miss the Messiah, and many of them would probably die and go to hell. And he's like broken hearted over his people, over individuals, over his city. It's over everything, and. Yeah, so he was a man acquainted. I think in Psalm 53, I think a man acquainted with tears. Or
yeah, and like when you were talking about that too, this is on page 82 of the manual. That like Jesus doesn't have to imagine what we feel; he felt what we felt, and that suffering produces like sympathy or empathy, like Jesus did. And I also read through like all of the book of Hebrews because you were saying, well, you could read through that. And I did this morning and I was like, just like that you understand, like we were not talking about how we weren't going to get into the why of suffering, but like Hebrews really describes why Jesus had to suffer and why he had to go through what he went through. So I really did like that point in the manual about like in this religion, in this relationship that we have, that we believe in, like this God that we know understands what we're going through is just phenomenal.
Yeah, actually, one of the so that our podcast listeners know, I kind of shared this with the church. I was doing some doctoral work, and the area that I wanted to concentrate on was I had termed it the necessity of suffering for discipleship development. Like if you don't suffer, you're going to be, your discipleship development is going to be hampered. You know, you're not going to fully develop as a disciple. And the first question I ask is suffering necessary? And there's actually 2 or 3 verses in the Bible that literally says Jesus had to suffer. It was necessary for him to suffer. And part of that is because one, suffering servant, the suffering Messiah, was part of the prophecy. So if he didn't suffer, like Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, and Psalm 22 or 22, I get my Psalms confused sometimes. There's so many Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah suffering that if he didn't suffer, he would have not qualified to be Messiah. The other reason it was a necessity was it was necessary for him to be identified as the Messiah, but it was also necessary for him to identify with us, and that whole live life like we did. So what Hebrews says is we have a high priest that sympathizes with us, that understands, that was tempted in every way, lived life just like us. It says he had to be made like his brothers so he could be a faithful high priest. And then it concludes, and since we have this high priest that's so good, draw near to God. And so it's all built on him identifying with us. That the greatest encouragement that we have is that God came to be just like us, so that we have somebody that identifies with us. So when we cry out to God, we're not crying out to someone who's aloof, who like, sorry, it's going bad, I don't understand that. But it's like a God who can look us in the eye and go, I understand, because I've been there too. And that's just huge. It's so huge.
I feel like it's like one of the most beautiful things. All right. Another thing you said is that suffering produces a longing for heaven. I'm just going to bring up a personal story here. So when my dad was sick, let's see if I can get through this. I was taking care of like all of his earthly needs because he started losing all functions everywhere. And he just kept saying over and over again, like, when's Jesus coming? When's Jesus coming? And I was like hurt by it because I was like, don't you care about like all the effort I'm putting in to like keep you here or like to help you get through this time? Anyways, but I couldn't see through the thick of it all that like I might have been taking care of his earthly needs, but like what my dad really needed was like for someone to take care of his soul. And so, whew, all right. Is it okay to like remind people who are ill that heaven follows their death, or should we like wait for them to accept that that might be God's will for them?
My experience, having sat beside the bed of a lot of people, most disciples, it's turned around different than that. They spend most of their time telling their loved ones where they're going and that they're ready to go and they're excited about going. I have a funny encounter that I probably shared with you personally. I don't think the podcast is a place to tell the whole story, but I served a man in my last church. His name was Walter Motika was his real name, and he was a great guy. And so I was visiting Walter one day, and he was sick, and yeah, so his name doesn't have to be changed for his safety. I think I'd want him to be proud about this. So anyway, I'm visiting him, and Walter loved the Lord, but he would say something to the effect, he's like, if they replaced everything that's wrong with me, it would no longer be me because there's just so many things going wrong. He's like, well, let me tell you the story, Jason. I was okay. And he's like, I took my nap down, sitting here in my lazy boy, I kicked back, I was taking my nap. And he's like, when I woke up, he's like, it was so peaceful. He's like, I had this wash, this peace over me. And it was kind of quiet and serene. And he said, the first thing I thought was like, finally, I got there. I've been waiting. Thank goodness I'm finally in heaven. He said, and then I heard it. And I'm like, what's that, Walter? He's like, the ceiling fan. And he's like, and he had a ceiling fan that had one of those little chains, and when it was running full speed, the little chain would hit the globe, tick, 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 tick. He's like, I heard the ceiling fan. And he's like, doggone it, I haven't gone yet. He was. I mean, that was his. He thought about going to heaven a lot, and he talked a lot about it. Right now, my own father-in-law is moving towards that. We know as a family that sometime short or long, we have no idea. And I was talking to him just the other day. Shelley was visiting him, and I said, how's your dad doing? And he apparently heard, and he can't hear, but he apparently heard the question, and he answered, well, tell him I'm still hanging on. The rope ain't broke yet. But he's talking to her about, I can't wait to start really living. I can't, and so often believers are that they are the more reassuring about where they're going. They're more excited about getting there than we are them going, kind of even like your dad, like, when's Jesus coming? Let's go. I'm ready. Like when they get to that spot, there's like this, that last little bit before that, before they board the train or whatever and get on the plane, however, before the chariot comes down, whatever it is, there's just like going on vacation, it's like, I can't, the night before you fly out to Florida or wherever, it's like, I just can't wait, and they're just really pumped up about it. And, I think that's encouraging. And I think, again, for us, it's just that longing to be there ourselves, and I was telling a group recently, I was talking to our seniors who are all older than me, as I evaluate my own life, when I was 30, I did not think about heaven a lot, other than in theological terms, like, oh, what's it like? Let me think about, and preach on it and form sermons on what heaven's like and that kind of stuff. Now that I'm 50, and I've had 20 more years of suffering in this world in various forms, and seeing the brokenness of this world, and seeing death and destruction and pain and suffering and trial and tribulation and loved ones hurting and things that I judge as unfair and catastrophic. And, I've had 20 more years of exposure to this very, very broken world. I find myself more often going, if Jesus came back today, I'd be okay with that. I really would. I'm the suffering of this world, it takes a toll on you, and it's cumulative and it's collective, and as you move through life and you experience more and more and more of it, you're kind of like, I'm going to a better place and I'm ready to be done with this.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I'm trying to think since we're in the 3D manual, like talking about displaying, like, should we embrace it now, but maybe with more of an attitude of like, I'm not ready to get out of here, but I'm excited about what's to come.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's what Paul says. Paul talks about, he's like, it's gain to be in heaven, to be with Christ. That's better than being here on earth. Mm-hmm. But he says, I'm pretty sure I'm going to stick around because that means fruitful ministry while I'm here. Mm-hmm. And so our anticipation for heaven should never be morbid, like, okay, I'm ready to, speed the process up or anything. Yeah. But it should be that longing, like you're on a journey, like we're driving across country, and we're going to Disney World or wherever, Disneyland or whatever, and that's my destination, but I got to make the trip, and and I'm going to make the trip as pleasant as I can and do as much as I can on the way, but that's not the ultimate destination.
Yeah, I got to do things along the way. I have jobs I need to do while I'm here. Okay.
Absolutely.
Another thing that you had said, I'll quote, is God wants to get us through suffering and not simply rescue us out of it or keep us from having it. He wants to use suffering to transform us and do something with us. And not just, oh, you're hurting, let me make it stop as quickly as I can. That's what we want God to do, but God has a different intent in his sovereignty. Very good. Good answer. All right. So I constantly juggle with this in prayer. Like, do I pray for healing for someone or like peace from a country that's at war? Or do I pray that they have comfort through their pain or their daily needs met? So like, how do I juggle this? Like,
oh, that's funny. Again, in real time, just yesterday, this exact same question came up in a Bible study that I lead. And so somebody took my same words. I love it when people use my words against me.
Sorry.
Took the same words and said, you said this is for your good. So should we be praying that God would put more suffering on you if this is for your good? That's the way they phrase this, basically the same question. And I'm like, well, I think certainly we are told, and I think 1 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 9, I believe, where Paul talks about, he was utterly beyond all he could bear so that he would turn to God. But it goes, and you must help us by praying for us so that many people will glorify God. So yes, I think we should pray we want suffering to end. We want people to be saved. We want them rescued. Mm-hmm. But it seems so often that's where we stop. And I think my first prayer, and so the way I've personally tried to think about this and respond to this teaching, as I was sharing with you, I'm working on my own my own suffering and trying to live up to my own sermons. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you preach better than you live, or or better than you practice. Is one of the main things I think's developed out of suffering is endurance, and I think we should often pray, help them endure. Mm-hmm. Help their faith, because this is a truth that I've seen quite often too, is like when people come to some suffering, especially significant pains of any of those kinds you've mentioned, is it's kind of a fork in the road, and people will often either turn away from God or they'll draw close to God at that time. Very few people stay stagnant, don't change when suffering comes. Okay. They almost always either move away or move closer to God in those moments. And so I think that's our prayer. Help them draw close to you at this moment, because that's what Paul says. He says, this was given to me so I would stop relying on myself and turn to God. And so we should be praying, use this to draw them close to you. Use this to strengthen their faith. Help them endure this, and end it as soon as they need to, but whatever, and the way I kind of phrase it, whatever brings you the most glory, do that.
So it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. Like, you can pray for both.
I think so. And I think we should. Yeah. And that way, because most of the time that suffering ends in some way or another, and it needs to be celebrated. I mean, even with the passing of someone, I think that needs to be celebrated. Okay, God. And
that suffering did end that way.
And we just recently did a podcast with talking about Bridget Beinhauer's story with Matt, her husband, and I think I shared this. I don't know if I gave it this detail, but the day she kind of told me she was convinced that she wasn't going to be healed, she said, my healing is not going to be on this side of heaven, but it's going to be on that side. And so even in that thought, you see, she's like, I am going to be healed. And so I celebrated in my own heart her passing because she had gotten the healing that she was expecting. And it was on that side of heaven. Not what we wanted, but I would argue in a lot of ways it brought God a lot of glory, you know, and her life and her testimony, and a lot of people got to hear that. And if you haven't heard that one,
go back. I think
go listen to that
episode
one
before this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
You know.
And touching on that, I was actually going to hit in the scripture coordinates, which don't forget to read those, folks, in your manuals. Is Psalm 34:19-20. Which says, many adversities come to the one who is righteous, but the Lord delivers him from them all. He protects all his bones, and not one of them is broken. When I first started thinking, like, I was going to ask, like, he doesn't deliver us from all our adversities. Like, sometimes we go to death with the same mental illness or the same whatever. But, you know, talking about what you were just saying, like, sometimes death is the end of the suffering. But I still do have another question in regards to this verse. Do you feel that God has delivered you from all the adversities in your past, or there's some that he still hasn't resolved yet?
Well, I would probably nuance that a little bit.
Okay.
I think that we think of deliverance as them going away. And I would think of deliverance more as able to handle.
Yeah, and I was thinking like endurance, like we were just discussing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a process. I wouldn't say that I haven't been delivered from all that I struggle with. I have overcome a lot, and I've gotten through a lot, and I've learned a lot. I know there's more to come, more suffering coming my way. I anticipate we're entering a season in my family and my life where, you know, we are going to be dealing with the passing of our parents. We haven't had that yet. And so that's a new phase of life that's coming. Shortly on the heels of that will be my own health and my wife's health starting to deteriorate. I mean, that's going to be coming within the next,
It's not something I think about, but yeah, you bring it
I
up.
think,
Yeah.
I really think about these things. Like, so I have an uncle who's 76, 77 now. He's the oldest male hunter in 2 generations at 77.
That's it.
And I'm 53, so I'm 24 years from. I mean, that's not long, you know. When and he's setting new records at 77.
Yeah.
He's the oldest male hunter to live in 2 generations. And I had an uncle who died. I had an uncle on my mom's side who died at 54, which is will be my birthday this year. And so I'm entering. I mean, just genetically, and you know, and so you see, I actually think about these things. I actually realize that my lifespan is probably shorter than most people's, and I am now, with the passing of my mother's brother and the passing of my father's family, I am in that zone where it would shock no one in my family if I had a massive heart attack at any moment. I mean, that's just the reality of life, you know, and most people don't talk about that. So you could, and the reason I talk about that so freely is I've thought about this a lot. I've anticipated it. This is a reality of my life, and I hope I'll handle it however, whatever. Could it be even something different? Absolutely, you know, but I think about those things. Yeah.
And so what I was going to continue to ask is we may never know how long we'll suffer with a particular matter. But we can be assured that someday, some way, God will deliver us from it. Is that kind of the promise? Okay.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, and sometimes the deliverance really is come home.
Yeah.
Just come to where there is no weeping and where there is no tears. Just come on home. And that's that really is the ultimate deliverance that we're all going to get to.
Okay, and then in my koinonia group, or cord group, in the koinonia section, we were reading a book called Not a Fan by Kyle Idleman, and I'm just going to read.
I hear there's a lot of corollaries between that and some
Yes, there is. Would you look at that? I'm just going to read from page 160 for a minute about how the cross is a symbol of suffering. Before crucifying a criminal, it was common for the Romans to beat them the way that they did Jesus. For this scourging, the man was stripped of his clothing, and his hands were tied most often to an upright post. The idea was that a person would have their hands tied around a post so that the flesh on their body would be stretched out tightly in preparation for the scourging. The number of lashes wasn't what the Romans paid attention to. They were experts in beating a person just to the edge of death. After being beaten beyond recognition, the Roman soldiers put the patubulum of the cross, which is like the horizontal beam, on the man's back. Perhaps some of the vertebrae were exposed from the flogging. This 125-pound beam was placed on his open wounds. It's no wonder Jesus had a difficult time carrying the cross as he stumbled down the narrow roads of the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Suffering. Taking up your cross and following Jesus can and will bring pain and suffering, and you can't carry a cross without suffering. There is no comfortable way to carry a cross. I don't care how you position it. I often talk to people who are convinced that some suffering or pain in their lives is the indication that they must not be following Jesus. After all, if they are following Jesus, the Son of God, doesn't it follow that things in life are going to unfold smoothly? There is this junk theology floating around out there that points to the difficulties as evidence that you must not be following Jesus. The biblical reality is that when people say yes to following Jesus, they are agreeing to carry a cross, and that will be painful at times. You've mentioned this, at least in the sermons. I don't know about on the podcast, but the prosperity theology about just because things aren't going well. So what I was going to ask following that excerpt is what kind of crosses do we carry today? Because obviously we're not going to be carrying a physical cross, but
right.
How do we do that today?
Wow, that one question could be an entire podcast. You gave more content there than you may even be aware of.
Yeah, I'm sure I did. But the reason I read that real quick, just because it hit me so hard of we're supposed to carry our cross. We're supposed to deny ourselves daily, and this is what it looks like. Yeah. And so, anyways, I just want to share that with
Well,
listeners.
one of the things that we have to recognize is every suffering is not cross carrying.
Okay.
And so, my bad back, my arthritis in my knee, my chronic pain, probably isn't cross bearing, because a lot of people will talk about their health issues and say, well, that's just my cross to bear. That's really not the picture of what the Bible's talking about there. Mm-hmm. So for something to be a cross we carry, it's a suffering we endure specifically because we're disciples, mm-hmm. specifically because we're following Jesus, specifically because we're trying to obey Christ. Mm-hmm. And so that may be ridicule in your job because you don't go out to the bar with all the coworkers after work. You're like, that's not what I do. That's not my scene because I'm following Christ. Mm-hmm. Or there's a lot of people, there's a lot of companies pushing agendas that are non-biblical, and people who take stands against their company because of their religious convictions about certain things. That's closer to cross-bearing. Mm-hmm. It could be, I've been called to do this ministry, and which means this may be, you may not think of it this way, but you serve as a trustee at our church, and once in a while you stay to lock up the building afterwards, mm-hmm. right? And you have to wait sometimes for a very long time for everyone to leave the building, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're denying yourself because you'd probably run off to the Chinese buffet as quick as you can to get there, Yeah. But you spend an hour sometimes waiting for everybody else to finish their chats and slowly meander out of the building and lock up behind them. So that's denying yourself for the good of somebody else, denying yourself for your church. So that's a little bit more, and that can be irritating. I mean, that might be a small irritation. That might only be a splinter of the cross, but that's moving in that direction.
I mean, the one thing I could think of in my personal life when I was reading through that was being mocked because we were waiting till marriage to consummate it.
Right.
And that was just a constant source of ridicule and why are you like that?
That's cross-bearing.
Yeah.
That's cross-bearing. Yeah. Because that's suffering because of your following, of causing of your discipleship. Mm-hmm. If you go into a 36-hour labor, that's not cross-bearing. Mm-hmm. you know what I'm saying? That's just
every human will go through that.
That's human suffering. And most of what most of the suffering in the Bible that it's talking about, when it talks about suffering, it's most often, not always, because it can be a wide range, is talking about persecution for your faith. And that's what the first church struggled a lot with. They were being really mistreated for their faith. We have been lucky to avoid that for most of my life, but there are serious signs within America, at least, that and that's part of the reason I want to preach this kind of stuff, is like, that's going to be on the rise. It is on the rise worldwide. Suffering and persecution of Christians is growing every year in the world, and it's probably not, and it's going to be more intense. And I believe in our country, and yeah, especially as we move further away from God. And so we're going to have more chances to bear crosses. And people are going to start to see that difference. But yeah, so I think that's a lot of what it is.
That's the cross we're going to bear. So I guess we'll close up with just encouraging listeners to, if you meet that fork in the road, to just draw closer and keep putting your faith in God.
Amen. Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Our prayer is that you've heard something today that will help you be a better disciple of Jesus Christ. We also want to encourage you to make sure you take your next step in your discipleship journey by considering what it is you would do about what you heard today, and then go and do it. Finally, we want to invite you to join us at 10:30 on Sundays, either at our Main Street campus in downtown Clarion between Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's, or online at fbcclarion.com. God bless.